Well, our journey with the King has been a long one. The first Sunday in Lent was February the 18th, 5 weeks ago. How far could we have gone in this time if we were literally walking? Well, it turns out we could have walked one of the most popular pilgrimage routes in the world, the Camino de Santiago, which happens to have been the image on our title slide over the last few weeks. Now, the most common route is the one that starts in France and is about 800 kilometers. Anybody ever done anything close to that? It's a long walk. It typically takes about 35 days to reach the Cathedral of St. James in Santiago, Spain. Now, that's far longer than I've ever walked in one go. During the question time on the first Sunday of Lent, I mentioned how I decided one day when I was on study leave to walk the rail trail from where it meets here in Ancaster all the way down to McMaster University. Do that in one day, walk there and back. It's a long journey. And I mentioned how unhappy my legs and feet were after that walk. And that's even, I try and walk, at least walk or run 5 days a week. It was the summer, so I was running, and I thought, I can manage this. So I put about 25 kilometers under my heels that day, which, as it turns out, is what you would need to have as your average daily distance if you wanted to do that walk to Santiago in 35 days. So I have to do some preparing if I was ever going to do that. It's a long journey. Now, the walk from Mount Tabor, the location where the Transfiguration is traditionally held to have happened, a mountain to the northeast of Galilee, the road from there down to Jerusalem, well in the south, is a good deal less than the Camino de Santiago, yet it is still a significant journey. It's somewhere between 100 and 200 kilometers. But as we've seen over the past 5 weeks, it's not so much about the physical distance of this journey that Jesus has been on with his disciples, but it's about how long and how challenging it can be to understand the way of Jesus and really walk it out. To understand that, yes, he is the Messiah. Yes, he is God's anointed king. But he's a king who will suffer. He is the firstborn of all creation, and yet he comes among us as one who serves. And therefore we are called to serve too. And win not through power, but through humility. And the disciples, they have struggled. We've watched them struggle and get it wrong again and again. And yet we have also seen Jesus' patience with them. Even as, just as they are on the doorstep of Jerusalem, they still are still far ways away. They have a long way to go. But again, that good news over these weeks is the patience of Jesus, that he doesn't give up on us even as he challenges us. The fact that he challenges us is not a measure of that he doesn't love us. He challenges us because he loves us, because he wants us to move on in our journey. And what is true of the Son is true of the Father as well. God doesn't want to give up on anyone. Yet as we arrive with Jesus in Jerusalem, after we get through the shouting crowds, we are reminded another challenging word, and that is that God's patience does eventually run out. And the time comes for one last chance. On Palm Sunday, we are reminded that Jesus is the King, the Son who speaks with the Father's full authority. And in moments like these, it certainly feels better to be behind Jesus than in front of him. They came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Well, as I said a few times on our journey to Easter, there are passages in here that I would much prefer to do a Bible study on than preach through, because there is so much going on in just these few verses that we look at in our reading today. But I'll try to be brief. The temple was the heart of Jewish life throughout the whole region, and certainly in Judea. There was no king anymore. In the king's place was a Roman governor. And so the temple was the heart of Judean political as well as religious life. The priests ruled the country on behalf of Rome. And they had a pretty good arrangement. Many people were unhappy with how the temple was being run. Different groups had different thoughts about how it should be, but there was a good deal of unease and unrest. And so many prophets turned to it, have been said before. One of the big issues was how the current group of leading priests had turned the temple into an ever more a money-making opportunity for them and their families. And that is partly what Jesus is challenging here. But there is, again, something deeper. There are a lot of different specific things we could go into, but Mark zooms in after this symbolic action on one statement from Jesus that really gives us the big picture. Jesus said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers"? One of the things that's important to understanding what Jesus is saying frequently throughout the Gospels is that he is almost always referencing the Old Testament scriptures, frequently quoting, paraphrasing, or alluding to the Hebrew Bible several times in one sentence, as he does here. And I always appreciate it when Bible translations helpfully point this out. Those little quotation marks are actually a big help to understanding what Jesus is saying. The first reference, "my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations," is taken from a beautiful vision of the prophet Isaiah chapter 56, about how reminding God's people of their mission, the mission that he had given them from the beginning, to be not just blessed for themselves, but that they are blessed to bless the whole world. And as it means for the temple here, the temple was designed to be a place where all nations could come to praise. There was a whole outer court of the temple for people who weren't Jewish. And yet that was where the money changers had been moved to bring more of that income into the temple leadership. And that was emblematic of an attitude of people who were treating the temple like it belonged to them. And it was for their blessing, for no one else's. But the most challenging part is the second one. The contrast between the beautiful vision of Isaiah and this image of a den of robbers, which comes from Jeremiah chapter 7. And it's important to know, Jeremiah, he's the prophet of doom. He was the prophet who was in Jerusalem when it was destroyed 700 years earlier by the Babylonians. He had warned them. He begged them to turn around. And Jeremiah chapter 7 is one of those prophecies. That not only were you treating the temple as something that belonged to themselves, the leadership at that time, they were treating it instead of like, the temple's supposed to be a refuge. A place where, yes, we can take refuge in God. But they were treating it like a robber's hideout. This is a place where we can go, be safe, and then from here we can go out and rob other people. We can steal, we can murder, we can treat it as our hideout, because it's God's temple. God will never let anything happen to his temple. And Jeremiah says, no. If you treat the Lord's temple this way, the Lord will take the temple away. And that is what happened. And that explains why the chief priests got so upset. They knew their Bibles just as well as Jesus did. They knew what he was saying. And yet, this is what so happens. The story repeats itself. God had a dream for the world and for his chosen people, and so often it turns into a nightmare. God wanted to be a refuge for them, not only for them, but for all people. God wanted them to go out from the refuge he provided for them and be active in the world. He wanted them to be active for good, to do his work, not to do whatever they wanted to do for themselves, not to steal, oppress, or make themselves rich and powerful. God wanted ultimately his people to bear good fruit. And so often, God got nothing of the kind. Which explains the strange story that wraps around the scene of Jesus in the temple. This is the first part. As they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went out to find if it had any fruit on it. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." How many of you felt bad for that fig tree? What did it do? Well, again, it's part of symbol. This is what Mark likes to do, what some scholars call make a sandwich. They'll have two stories interpret each other. And part of that is, again, this is an echo of Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah 7, he gives a warning, and Jeremiah 8, he talks about how God is upset, how he went to his people. It was like going to an olive tree and getting no fruit, and going to a fig tree and getting no figs. This is a symbolic act by Jesus, using a well-known symbol. A fig tree was part of the good life that he had promised Israel. Everyone sitting under their own vine and fig tree. God wants Israel to be like a fruitful tree, and so often he has come and he has found no fruit. And so this is the warning that he gives first to his disciples, and then a bit later on, there's the well-known, again, if you follow through these stories year after year in Holy Week, you often come across the story of the wicked tenants, where he tells it to everybody. It's a reminder that God wanted good fruit from his people as they took refuge in him. So what does all this have to do with us here today in our time and place? Well, as I suggested earlier, I don't think we are in the crosshairs of what Jesus has to say here. I don't think we are in the position of the leading priests who control the temple and city and ultimately the nation. We're not with those colluding with the Romans, I don't think today. I think there were perhaps times in the history of the church where maybe, yes, these words were appropriate, where the church misused the power that we had. That's not quite where we are in this time and place. I think today, for us here, we can genuinely see ourselves in the disciples and the crowds watching Jesus do all this. Jesus challenged the powerful, the corrupt, those who are misguided. But it doesn't mean we can sit back in safety, smile at their mistakes, or even have a sigh of relief that we are not them. Jesus is doing all this for his disciples to see, which means he's doing this for us too. He knows that the chief priests, the Sadducees, the scribes, and other religious elites will not listen to him as much as he wants them to. He knows that what he says and does here will lead directly to his death on the cross. Yet he says and does it anyway. He does this in part because God believes in last chances. Even for those who seem hopeless, even for those who have had a million chances already, he still gives it one more go. Even now, he wants the priests to change and be saved, even though it seems unlikely. Yet I think that Jesus' primary audience is with those who are following him, and those in the crowds who are at least open to seeing the world differently, who are willing to listen and give Jesus a shot. He wants us to learn from the mistakes of the priests and leaders of Roman Judea and choose a different path, to choose to walk his path instead. And so we can look at that warning he gives in the temple and see the positive outcome, what he wants for us, for anyone who follows him and through him becomes part of God's people. First, that dream, that beautiful dream of Isaiah 56, that we would build a house of refuge and prayer for all people. Because Lord knows, people need refuge in every time and every place. We need refuge from just what happens in life. Refuge from sickness. Refuge during hardship. Refuge when life has not turned out the way we hoped, no matter how hard we worked for it. Refuge when we are mistreated. Refuge when life is not fair. Refuge when there is a time when we just want to hide away from the grief. Refuge. People need refuge. We need refuge. But it's important that we remember that this refuge is not just for us, it is for all. And therefore we hear the call to build a house of refuge, a house of prayer for all people. And the second thing is to use that refuge as a home base for going out, for doing good, for bearing good fruit, rather than be a hideout for robbers, to be the right kind of home base, a refuge from which we can draw strength, we can know safety and love, a place where we can get charged up, renewed, healed, so we can go out there. And this is all of what we've been talking about together as a church over the last year. And this is where God, I believe, is leading us. And I think that puts us in a good place to hear this message again today as it comes from Jesus. And this story we come to every year. God has been getting us ready to do this. But I also know not all of us are in a place to be active. Not all of us are in a place to be beyond, to think beyond what we're going through right now. And so as I wrap up today, there is, yes, a call to follow Jesus into action as he walks to Jerusalem, through Jerusalem. But most of all, there is a reminder that there is legitimate refuge. If you're weak, if you're struggling today and in this season, there is a refuge. And it's not a temple, a building, a place 1,000 miles away. It is right here. Because the remarkable thing that Jesus says in this is that He is the temple. And anyone can find refuge in Him today. And when we're ready, when He's done His work in us, then yes, we can go out and welcome others in. But we do that out of the place of refuge that we have in Jesus. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.